Well, good morning and welcome to the Tuesday morning Bible study. It is Tuesday, June the 6th. June the 6th. There's an historic date for you. Yeah,
Yes.
June the 6th. All right. So we are in we are in Mark chapter 12, verse 1. We finished up chapter 11 last time. And actually, as I recall, had a really good time unpacking what Jesus said to those who questioned his authority, and pointed out how Jesus, in good Jewish rabbi fashion, more often than not, answered questions with a question of his own. And so that was a fun lesson. All right, well, let's get to it then. In chapter 12, we're going to look at verse 1 and go forward. I think we're going to read. Yeah, let's read through verse 12. And by the way, just to set the scene, because the scene is important here. Jesus has had his ride into Jerusalem on the donkey. We can place these events then at the beginning of the final week of Jesus's earthly life. He has come into Jerusalem, and now he's had his initial demonstration with both the donkey ride, but then also the overturning of the tables of the money changers. He has thrown down the gauntlet of challenge to the powers that be. He has attracted what most people would regard as unwelcome notice from people who are now motivated to destroy him. And so what follows then are from chapter 11, verse 27 on through chapter 13 is a series of dialogues which Jesus has in the temple, where he is challenged by various forms of religious authorities. And he is confronted, and Jesus always has, as we will see, the perfect comeback. I even preached a series of sermons called Jesus's Greatest Comebacks, and used these chapters as the basis for that series. All right, so having dealt with the first of those comebacks in chapter 11, verse 27 through the end of the chapter, let's start with the second of these. Then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. And then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. And finally he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." And so they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. When they realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd. So they left him and went away. All right. Let's unpack this. What are some thoughts or questions that y'all have?
Well, it seems that, it's almost an allegory or a prognosis of what is to happen to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
The beloved son is sin and they kill him too.
Right. Indeed. Indeed. And once again, we can read this text on at least two levels anyway. We can read it as, as a record of what Jesus is saying about his own situation. That Jesus is anticipating his own death. He sees himself as the son in this parable. And so he is, looking ahead to his own rejection and to his own being killed. But we can also read it from the point of view of the early Christians who are in the peculiar situation of being under fire from both sides, under fire from Jews and under fire from Romans. As Jerusalem is about to be destroyed by the Romans, temple destroyed and all that. And so you could see this from the second point of view. You could see it as a parable that reflects the experience of these early Christians under fire from both sides and interpreting the events that are happening around them. Yeah.
Is there any way this could be when the parable talks about sending, first one servant and then another, and they're all beat or killed? Is there any way that could refer to the prophets of old?
Yes, that's exactly what it's referring to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This is both, from Jesus's point of view and from the point of view of the early Christians. This is this.
Oh, no, I'm not talking about Christians. I'm talking about Old Testament.
No, I know you are. What I'm saying is that from the point of view of Jesus telling the parable, and from the early Christians telling of Jesus telling the parable, that is exactly how they understand Jesus. They understand Jesus as the culmination of a series of people that have been sent to Israel by God. God is, obviously God is the vineyard owner, and that these various slaves who have been sent by the owner of the vineyard are indeed the prophets sent to Israel. And by and large, as we know both from the Old and New Testaments, by and large, prophets have a rough time of it, for the most part.
And I assume he was also including right before him John the Baptist.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And so this is said with the very immediate awareness, the longer, the longer term knowledge of what happened to the prophets of old, but the shorter term knowledge of what happened to John the Baptist. Mm-hmm. John the Baptist was, in fact, rejected, as we know from the end of chapter 11. He was rejected by the Jewish religious authorities, and yet the religious authorities were too cowardly to say that they had rejected him, because they knew that the people held John in high regard. They were too cowardly to admit to their rejection of him. But it was the Jewish pro-Roman authorities, typified by or epitomized by Herod Antipas, the pro-Roman but Jewish authorities, political authorities, that ultimately had John executed. Okay. I mean, in the Jewish past, political and religious power was often unified, right? That is to say, the Israelite or the Jewish kings of old in the line of David they were not priests, they were kings. Okay, so their power was definitely political, but they were nevertheless seen, at least by formal institutional religion, as chosen and anointed of God to rule. Okay. So they weren't formally religious leaders, but they were seen as chosen of God. And so the kingship itself had a religious aura over it. Okay. And so when the prophets then were rejected by the powers that be, the powers that came against the prophets of old were of both political and religious dimensions. When Jeremiah, I mean, we were talking about Jeremiah not that long ago. When Jeremiah preached his great temple sermon in Jeremiah chapter 7, and his attack on the temple as having become corrupt, as not living up to the divine intention for it, but had become essentially a tool of corruption. His attack was both of a political and religious nature. And the opposition to him was of a political and religious nature. So in the same way, the opposition to John the Baptist was of a political and a religious nature. The opposition now coming together against Jesus is of a political and a religious nature. And so it's, so it ended badly for many of the prophets. The prophets can almost be defined by this opposition. Now, the thing that's important to recognize is that, and I say the opposition came from, was often religious. This is the thing to remember. This is something that a lot of people don't get their minds fully around. We cannot underestimate the importance of this religious dimension to the opposition to the prophets, because the religious people, the religious authorities who throughout the ages were opposing the prophets, were doing so, at least as they understood it, were doing so from the standpoint of religion. The prophets were wrong on religious grounds. Okay, I mean, so they believe. They may have been, these religious leaders of the past may have been, thoroughly compromised and thoroughly corrupt. But on one level, they were probably sincere. Okay, they probably really believed that these prophets were opposed to God, were opposed to, and maybe a better way of saying things, opposed to God's order of things. Okay, they probably sincerely believed that. When religious opposition crystallized against Jeremiah, they probably accused him of his attack on the temple, Jeremiah's attack on the temple operation, was probably seen as a gross affront to God. How dare you attack God's house? How dare you attack God's house? This is the house that God has chosen to live in. How dare you say that it's corrupt and that it'll be destroyed and all of this? I mean, do you not believe that God lives here? Do you not believe God will protect us? What kind of atheist must you be, Jeremiah? That's the kind of reaction That's the kind of reaction that came. The people that oppose the prophets do so because they believe that their religion is under threat from the prophets. Now we know, because we occupy sort of the omniscient point of view. We come from that point of view, and we know that the prophets are right. Okay. And the prophets are always honored retrospectively. You get to the time of Jesus, and all the religious leaders would have told you, oh yeah, Jeremiah was a true prophet. Isaiah, he was a true prophet. I mean, they would all, in hindsight, they would all say, oh yeah, these people were wonderful. These people brought the true word of God. Micah, Amos, all of them, they all spoke the true words of God. The religious leaders of Jesus's day would have said that. Okay. Problem is that their fundamental lack of understanding of what those prophets were doing leads them to miss the prophets of their own time. Okay. And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole right now. Anyway, I think there will come a time where I think it'll be more instructive to dwell on it a little bit. But it's, we see this in our own day. Everybody. I mean, unless you're just a whack job, everybody is going to say nice things about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Everybody's going to say nice things about him, Okay, everybody's going to say, oh, he stood for love, he stood for tolerance, and couldn't we all have a little more love and tolerance in the world? I mean, everybody, pretty much everybody. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, everybody, will sing his praises today. Okay. 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, people were not saying that. Okay. They were not saying that 60 years ago. He was an agitator. He was a rabble rouser. He was a troublemaker. Okay. He was getting people upset over things that ought not to be interfered with too much. Okay. Today we can say, oh, love and tolerance, and wow, he was such a prophet. Why can't the black leaders of today be more like Martin Luther King? The truth of the matter is that the same way many people look on movements for liberation and social justice today, the people of today say exactly the same things about the agitators of today. Say exactly the same things that the socially equivalent people of 60 years ago, 70 years ago, were saying about Dr. King. Exactly the same things. Exactly the same things. And it is only the benefit of time and distance that people of today can look back on 60, 70 years ago and say, oh yeah, he was all about love and tolerance. He really was a true spokesman for God. Okay. But you can only do that. You can only say that with a serious blind spot to what's happening in your own world. You can only say that with a serious blind spot to your own world. And this is what I mean when I say, when the religious leaders of Jesus's day would look back on the prophets of old and praise them. And yet, as Jesus himself pointed out, he said, you praise these prophets of old and you say, well, if we had been around when they came, we would not have persecuted them. We would not have done such and such. Jesus says, you are no different than your ancestors. You're no different than them. They persecuted the prophets of their time. You're persecuting the prophets of your own time. And that's just the simple fact. So this is what Jesus, this is what is behind Jesus telling this parable. The history of prophets being rejected. And they are rejected because they criticize corruption. They also criticize hypocrisy. They criticize religion being used to maintain a social order rather than to critique a social order.
So
Yeah.
Tom,
Yeah.
what about the economic underpinnings of this parable? I mean, so the owner of the vineyard just wants the profits from his share. And the greedy tenants want it all. I guess that's it, right?
You know, that is a very interesting point. I wondered, I had read that and noticed it myself, but I wondered if anybody was going to bring it up. And I'm glad you did, because from the language of the parable, it sounds like the vineyard owner has other vineyards.
Yeah.
You know, it sounds like he has other. Now we understand in this parable that the vineyard that is under issue here is Israel itself. Okay, Israel is the vineyard. That too has a deep root in the prophets. The prophets of the Old Testament, often Isaiah probably most famously speaks of Israel as a vineyard that God is the keeper of, right? And then what happens is that the vineyard starts growing wild grapes, bad grapes, you know, so there's corruption within, and it's causing bad fruit to result. But it's really interesting that the way it sounds is that it sounds like there are other vineyards, that God is up to something with Israel. I mean, certainly Israel is elect. Israel is deeply important. And yet there seems to be God's vision, God's purposes go beyond Israel, to embrace a larger world. And so that seems to be at least partially behind this business of the vineyard owners, or I'm sorry, the vineyard workers being jealous for the land that they work, for the vineyard that they work, and driving out the any sense of accountability from the owner of the vineyard. This is the heir, come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. Yeah. That's good. That's good. Now this is the final part of this, where he's the consequence, the stated consequence of what Jesus is foreseeing, the death of the Son. Okay. What he sees then as the consequence of that is that the owner of the vineyard will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Okay. And then he says, have you not read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. You know, again, reading it on two levels. This is Jesus saying that there are going to be some dire consequences to his own death. There are going to be dire consequences for the people as a whole, but also from the point of view of the Christians who are under fire from both sides, and they're witnessing. I mean, they're effectively witnessing the destruction of the Jewish nation at the hands of the Romans before their eyes in their own lifetimes. They're witnessing the destruction of Israel before their eyes, and that this seems to be connected in their mind and in Jesus's mind, seems to be connected to Jesus being rejected. And so, in essence, explaining the judgment, explaining how this could happen, that Jerusalem would be destroyed, that it would come as a consequence of this. This is where interpretation is very important, because it would be easy to read this and to interpret it in one particular fashion, which I think is not only untrue, but I think it's deeply harmful. And that is to interpret this along, this is a big fancy theological word, along supersessionist lines. Supersessionism is the theological viewpoint that Israel has been replaced as God's elect people, okay, has been replaced as God's elect people in favor of the church. Okay, that Israel as an ethnic, as a nation in that sense, a group of people bound together by common faith, culture, and ethnicity, that Israel has been rejected by God and has been replaced in God's affections by the church. Therefore, non-Christian Jews no longer have any claim to special election or special chosenness in God's eyes. In other words, the Jews are no longer God's chosen people. The church is God's chosen people. Okay. This is supersessionism. Okay. Now, this point of view, I might add, is explicitly rejected by the Apostle Paul himself. Okay. If you doubt what I say, go and read Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11 Romans chapters 9 through 11 actually deal with the problem of, if Israel supposedly rejected its Messiah, then what now of Israel? Does Israel still have any special place in God's economy if it's rejected its Messiah? And after quite a theological development, of building a case over 3 chapters worth, by the time you get to chapter 11, it's clear that Paul's answer to that question is no, it does not end God's special relationship with even non-believing Israel. I mean, non-believing, again, from the standpoint of Jesus. No, it does not end God's special relationship with Israel. The church is important. Yeah, absolutely. The church certainly is important now. But if anything, God's people now have become it's Paul's answer is that it's a both and rather than an either or. It's not Israel's been rejected and now the church has replaced Israel. It's, in a way, it's Israel and the church, or more technically correct, it is an expanded notion of what Israel, what even the word Israel means. That is a vastly more inclusive understanding of what Israel means, which includes, to go back to the etymology of the word Israel, all the people with whom God is especially engaged and struggling with. Remember Jacob, when he is named Israel, the explanation that the mysterious stranger in Genesis 32 gives is, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and human beings and have prevailed. You have striven with God and with human beings. This recognition is not a recognition of Jacob's special holiness, or Jacob's special righteousness or anything like that. It is a recognition of the bond that God has with Jacob and that Jacob has with God, purely because of their shared history of struggling with one another. And that's what becomes the basis for Jacob being renamed. Israel then is defined as those who, in God's choosing a group of people to struggle with. Okay. And that struggling can take place whether those people, from the Christian point of view, whether those people believe everything that it would be ideal for them to believe or not, that God is engaged with them in a special and unique way. Okay. And it is a bond, it is a relationship, it is a bond, an election of love. It is a love that doesn't let go. When Paul talks about this, does Paul want the Jews to receive Jesus as their Messiah? Of course he does. Of course he does. Paul wouldn't be Paul if he, didn't want that. Or he wouldn't preach Christ if he didn't want that to happen. But for him, the Jews, whether they embraced Christ as Jesus as their Messiah or not, were nevertheless God's people and were bound to God in love, in the divine love. They still have this special elect place in God's exertions, God's love and God's efforts. And so with all of that, I say all of that to say that to interpret this text here at the end of chapter, or here at the end of the passage we read, to read that as God's now rejecting ethnic Israel in favor of people who are not Jews, is to misunderstand what's going on. and it's certainly to theologically to deal deeply and adequately theologically with the significance of what's being said here. It is true that for Jesus, it's clear for Mark and for Mark's community that these things that are happening, or from Jesus's point of view, are going to happen, and from Mark's community's point of view, are happening. That these things are related to, are connected to what happened to Jesus. Okay, I mean, it is clear that those things are connected for them. Okay, but it is not a final statement upon what God is committed to, who God is committed to, who God is specially bound to in love. And it sure can look like rejection, because yeah, Jerusalem's getting battered. You know, Jerusalem's getting battered by the Romans. Once again, to go back to Jeremiah's time, when Jeremiah would talk about, you know, the coming judgment of Babylon, you know, Babylon coming and, you know, destroying Jerusalem and taking the people into exile, you know, or taking some of the people into exile, that would be experienced by Jeremiah and experienced by Jeremiah's contemporaries as divine judgment, as it would be experienced as a consequence of Israel's failing to live up to the covenant. But remember what it is that Jeremiah sees as violations of the covenant. It's Israel's corruption. It's the political and the religious leaders' corruption and their hypocrisy, and they're selling out the poor and all of that. All of that is what constitutes the covenant violation. Okay, and what then Jeremiah sees as the inevitable judgment of God on a nation that continues along these lines. And this is why prophets are always unpopular, at least in their own time. They're always unpopular in their own time because they strike at the interests of power, and they tell people that they need to change. that they need to change, and that the system needs to change. The whole order of things needs to change. Because if it doesn't change, here's what's going to happen. You know, eventually the chickens are going to come home to roost. You know, eventually you promote injustice, you promote inequality, you promote exploitation and oppression, you promote that, you tacitly support it long enough, you eventually are going to reap the whirlwind. And that is the history of Israel through all its encounters with its prophets. Frankly, it's the history of America too. You ignore justice, you ignore the exploitation and oppression of people, and eventually there's going to be a reckoning for it. And it's going to, you know, I mean, we could talk at length about the ways in which that's true. But there's, you know, that you can do that only for so long without there being a reckoning, because eventually it will come. And so, but even so, even with that judgment, even with that reckoning, in Israel's case, we'll stick with Israel for now, God doesn't give up on Israel. God can be awfully angry at Israel. God can be really upset over Israel's and the way Israel sells out to power, sells out to the exploitation of the poor, and all this kind of stuff. God can be awfully angry about that, and it can result in judgment. And yet the prophets, when they're done with their words of judgment, there's usually a word of redemption. There is a, and it may take a while, because at a certain point, when the judgment is looming, maybe that's all anybody can think about. Maybe that's all the prophet can think about, is the coming judgment itself, and not be able to look past it too far. But eventually the prophetic vocation, as we see in the Old Testament, the prophetic vocation, which Walter Brueggemann of Columbia Theological Seminary for years and years would write of this, that the prophetic vocation was a word often of judgment and condemnation, but it was also part of the vocation was re-energizing. God did not judge. God did not judge purely for the sake of judgment, purely for the sake of destruction. The story does not end there. It is a pattern of judgment, but then of renewal. And so the prophet, if the prophet lives long enough, the prophet has, in the words of the beginning of Jeremiah, you may remember this language of tearing down, but then of building up. Yes, there is a tearing down. The old oppressions, the old idols, all the things that keep God's people from being all that they can be in relationship with God, those things have to be torn down. And sometimes that hurts a lot. It has to be torn down, but the point of that process is not just feeling bad, feeling awful, being beaten down, being oppressed, being judged, being condemned. It is so that God's people then can be renewed, can be restored, but in right relationship to God, in right relationship to one another. And so all of that, all of this reality is behind these first 12 verses in chapter 12. This history of Israel's relationship with its own prophets. Here, though, we are in a moment where Jesus knows the judgment is coming. The reckoning is on the horizon. And then Mark's community is seeing the reckoning being played out, which the biblical writers very much do see, or the New Testament very much sees, in the vein of what happened with Israel in the time of Jeremiah. Okay. Oh, man, this is good stuff. Love it, love it, love it. Okay. Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts on that? I almost don't want to start the next section because we can start it. We can start it, but there's so much to say about it. I mean, there's no way we're going to finish this. If we start it, we're not going to finish it. Just know that in advance. Let's read the next section. This is one of the most beautifully and magnificently misunderstood passages in the whole Bible. Verse 13. Jesus has just had his parable. He's just told his parable about the wicked tenants. The powers that be that were listening perceived that this parable was against them. They were right about that. It was against them. And it says they wanted to arrest him because they were offended, all this. But they feared the crowd. They feared the crowd because the crowd was listening. And so they left him and went away. So, verse 13, next little episode. Then they sent to him, the religious authorities are they sent to him some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. Because we established from the previous passage, they want to arrest him, but they fear the crowd. They can't do it in public. This ultimately is going to be why they do what they do with Judas and trying to take him in secret and trying to basically get him, have it be too late before anybody knows what's happened. Okay. So they're looking for an excuse to have him arrested. They send to him some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth." Okay, now that they've buttered him up a little bit, they've set him up. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor, pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? But knowing their hypocrisy, Jesus said to them, "Why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see it." And they brought one. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's, Caesar's." Jesus said to them, "Then give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were utterly amazed at him. Okay. The one thing, before I do want you to raise your own questions about everything. The one thing that the traditional, or that some traditional interpretation of this passage does get right, is that Jesus's answer is intentionally evasive. Okay. His answer is intentionally ambiguous. I won't explain that right now. But that part is right, is that the answer is intentionally evasive. On the grounds that Jesus would say, "My time has not yet come." Jesus could think to himself, I do have thoughts on this. And I may be even giving some hints in what I just said. Okay, I'm dropping some hints about what I think. But it's also true that my time has not yet come, and I'm not going to let this be the moment that they hang me. Okay. Right. All right. Thoughts, questions?
I'm just fascinated by that last sentence. I mean, it sounds like he's really flummoxed them. They were amazed. I mean, that's a neat translation, because it's like, wow. He got himself out of that one.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I mean with the greatest comeback series. I mean, this is like the greatest comeback Jesus could have come up with. And it's so simple. It's deceptively simple. There's actually a lot going on in the response, but it's very, very clever. It's a very clever response. And so it's like even Jesus's enemies, I mean, it's like they've got to tip their hat to him, like, oh, that was good. That was really good. So simple on one level, but very clever response.
Is what are the things that are the emperors?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. What does belong to the emperor? What does belong to God? It's a great question. We'll deal with all this mostly next week, but that's, I mean, that really is fundamentally the question to wrestle with, you know, to really unpack what Jesus is doing here. That's a key set of questions. What does belong to the emperor, and what does belong to God? Let that, I want to sit on that. I just allow that to brew, allow that to slow brew between now and next week, okay? Because that's going to be a key question, set of questions. To start off, though, to set the scene and to fully appreciate what's happening here, the religious authorities have sent some people. And, you know, it's easy, you know, without digging deeper, it's easy to think that all the people who opposed Jesus were exactly on the same page. And they weren't. They all were against Jesus, but not necessarily for the same reasons. Okay. And this is a really instructive episode because you have Pharisees and Herodians. Let's unpack that a little bit. Who are the Pharisees? Okay, we know the Pharisees. Pharisees are all about the covenant renewal of Israel through a strict observance of God's law. God's law being understood not just as the literal words of the Torah, but the Torah as interpreted through Pharisaic tradition. Okay, so, you know, I've talked about, you know, in the time since the exile, so, you know, 500 years worth of Israel living in its own land again, and having 500 years to apply the written law in concrete situations, which the original source of the Torah couldn't necessarily have conceived of. Just as the United States Constitution was written in, you know, long before all the possible things all the possible questions and scenarios and circumstances would ever arise that would then you would try to adjudicate by going back to something written 200 years ago, you know. So in the same way, you know, you had 500 years worth of people coming to the judges and saying, well, you know, I have this dispute or I have this issue. What does God's law have to say about my situation? And inevitably there, you know, in cases of law, often you have a case of competing claims. That is to say, the law, the written law values one thing, but it also values something else. It values freedom, you know, for example, to use an American thing, it values freedom of expression. Okay, the law, freedom of speech, it values that, but it also values social order and peace. And so, you know, is the freedom of speech always and everywhere absolute? Or are there certain things, certain expressions of freedom of speech which actually shouldn't be upheld? For example, the famous Oliver Wendell Holmes observation that you don't have the right to shout fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire. You know, that you don't have a right to do that. You know, because the freedom of speech is not absolute. It's highly valued, but it's not absolute because there's also the interest the law has in keeping people from stampeding over one another. Okay. So you balance the claim of freedom of speech with the the right that people have to not get stampeded over one another. And you try, and so the history of jurisprudence is essentially trying to balance these things in concrete situations. And so that is why we speak of judges interpreting the law. It's not always just a case of applying the law, because often the situations that are brought to them are more complex than just say, okay, well, this is the situation, this is what the law says, do what the law says. Again, sometimes the situations are more complicated than that, and you have to balance one value of the law versus another value of the law and do so in a way that does justice to the different parts of the law, and hopefully, ideally, provides justice to the people involved. Okay, well, that's what the Pharisees did for 500 years in their own way of trying to apply religious law. And so they did, and they built up over time, they built up a series of traditions and what we might think of as legal precedents that then became authoritative, just in the way courts today will appeal to precedents when they issue their own rulings. Now, sometimes, as we have seen, they overthrow precedents. Okay, but often they don't. Often they to appeal to a precedent is to appeal to a deeper authority, and they do feel, at least most courts in most cases, do feel a certain obligation to uphold precedents. Okay, so with that, the Pharisees have this body of tradition and they follow it. They do their best to follow it. Now, we've talked in the past about the ways in which the Pharisees kind of got the letter of the law right and the spirit of the law wrong. Okay, but that's really, I don't want to belabor that point right now. The Pharisees held a very strict view of what constituted idolatry. And you will recall a commandment, one of the 10 commandments, that Christians pay absolutely no attention to today. Okay, I mean, it's one of the commandments that, for all of Judge Moore's things in Alabama, it's one of the commandments that nobody pays absolutely any attention to, and it's the prohibition against graven images. Okay, and yeah, you're not supposed to worship those graven images, but strictly speaking, you're not really supposed to make images at all. Okay, Muslims actually care, it's actually in Islam, it's actually against Islamic law to create an image of a statue or even an artistic representation of God or of Muhammad, right? Okay. In this way, modern Islam is actually closer to kind of what ancient Judaism was like in this respect. You just didn't make graven images of things, and especially didn't make graven images of things that might lead someone to worship that, okay, or to make images of things that might claim some kind of rivalry to God, to God. Okay. The Pharisees believed, number one, they resented Roman occupation. Like many Jews of Jesus's day, they resented Roman occupation. And they regarded the coins, the denarius, the coin with which the tax was to be paid, they regarded that coin as a violation of God's law. The coin had a graven image of the emperor. The emperor made a number of theologically dubious claims, or at least the emperor cult anyway, made any number of dubious claims about the emperor's status. On the coin, on the particular coin, actually, the denarius that is in question here, there's the image of the emperor. In this case, it would have been an image of Tiberius Caesar. And on the inscription, it would speak of Tiberius as Augustus, not the proper name Augustus, but the title Augustus. That is the majestic, the august, the magnificent. It usually was seen as a kind of divine title. Okay, but also would speak of Caesar as Filius Deus, Latin for son of God, okay, or son of the gods, right? Caesar was seen as divine. And this theological idea, perverse as it is, was memorialized on the coin that the tax was to be paid with. The taxes to Caesar were to be paid with. Okay. This, incidentally, is why money changers were important, because you brought your own money. In order to pay the tax, you had to get your money changed. You had to turn in your own money so that you could get the denarii that you would pay the tax with. Because a good observant Jew, for example, like the Pharisees, would not carry that coin on their person, because they would see it as a violation of both the commandment against graven images, but also against the commandment that you shall have no other gods before me. The Pharisees would not even carry the coin in their pocket. And observant Jews in general, whether Pharisees or not, would not even carry the coin on their person, because they saw it as a violation of God's law. Okay, now so that was the Pharisees' position. In other words, no, in a way, you don't pay taxes to Caesar, or in any way, or you do it in a way, you do it indirect. If you do pay them, you pay them indirectly. You don't do it directly, because to handle that coin is idolatry, or to carry that coin's idolatry. Okay, so that's the Pharisees' position. The Herodians were the polar opposite of that. The Herodians were the supporters of Herod Antipas. They were what Jesus and observant Jews in general, Pharisees included, would have called sinners. The Herodians were sinners. They were people who didn't give anything. I'm not going to use bad language here. They did not care one bit about religious law. They did not care. They lived in total flouting of it. Certainly Herod Antipas lived that way. And Herod's supporters did not care about it, only insofar as they could exploit it, to rouse up people's support. But they didn't care about it. And therefore, they didn't have any problem with carrying the coin. Okay, they didn't have any issue with it. They were fully in support of the system. They were fully in support of the regime. And so they were for paying the taxes to Caesar. In other words, the Pharisees and the Herodians were at odds without Jesus being involved. The Herodians and the Pharisees were already in dispute with each other on the question of taxes to Caesar. Okay. And so the religious leaders that sent Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus thought, these guys are already having this debate among themselves, and it's a pretty volatile thing. Now, here's Jesus. Let's have Jesus get confronted with their debate, take a side, have Jesus then enter the debate, take a side, and then alienate half the people or more. Take a side and alienate half or more of the people in one fell swoop and destroy his credibility. And possibly have him take a side and get in trouble with the authorities. Beautiful. It's the perfect trap. He either takes one side and destroys his credibility with the people, or he takes another side and he gets the unwelcome attention of the Roman authorities, who arrest him for advocating against paying taxes. That goes over about as well in ancient Judaism as it would go over today, not paying your taxes. Okay. And so that is the trap. That's the essence of the trap that the religious authorities see as possible, that they can a predicament they can put Jesus in by sending representatives of an already existing debate and have them draw Jesus into it and get him in trouble where he is, in a manner of speaking, damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. All right. So with that, now that I've laid out the problem, it's time to go. And so we're going to, I want you to hold on to all these wonderful thoughts, and particularly the ambiguity of Jesus's answer at the end. And next week we will unpack what Jesus is doing in his response, how he responds. I already said it's undeniable that Jesus is being intentionally ambiguous. He's being intentionally evasive. And yet, he is also, brilliantly, he is also, in a subtle fashion, answering the question. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and wrap up for today. Oh, this is good. Good stuff. Okay. All right. Well, let us close with prayer. Are there any it's been what, 3 weeks, 2 weeks since we've met. Are there any updates, any things that we might want to include in our
I wanted to say one thing.
Yeah.
I'm doing a lecture for the National Endowment for the Humanities on Flannery O'Connor this Thursday night in Milledgeville and at Georgia College. And there is supposedly a free live stream if you would like to for me. I can send the link to Tom. Oh, he's got it.
No, do send it to me. If you send me the link, it'll be easier for me to get it out. I do have it in my calendar, and I have it and I have a thing on my Facebook that I can plug into. But no, do send it to me, because it'll facilitate my sharing it with everybody else.
The title of it is, in retrospect, memorable one-liners and the one hard line. You can probably imagine what that one hard line is. So,
oh yeah,
Catholicism, her Catholicism. Okay.
Yeah. No, this is perfect. I look forward to it. It's 7 o'clock on Thursday. Yeah. Good. So yeah, no, prayers for you, and yeah, send me the link and I'll send it to everybody else, and we'll hopefully anybody and everybody can join. I truly look forward to it. Lois, how is Carol?
She seems to be doing okay. I think she's cancer free right now. Goes
Oh,
back in
wonderful.
one of these days for another CAT scan to check on her, but I think she's doing very well.
That
At
is fantastic.
Yeah. I
That is
still think
fantastic.
prayers are good because it's kind of maintenance, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
And then an update on Bill.
yeah.
We went to see the neurosurgeon again. Well, the nurse practitioner. I don't think the doctor even exists because we never see him. But and he's doing pretty good. The pain is less. It was interesting to me to listen to him answer the questions about his pain level because he never tells me the pain is getting better. I just have to observe. And he said, yes, you know, it's getting better. They the fractures, they don't know. They're hoping they're healing, but they didn't get any worse. There are no new ones or anything like that.
Mhm.
So that's doing pretty well. Now we've got to go see a kidney specialist in about 2 to 3 weeks because he's got kidney problems, and he's still being seen by the blood person over at
Mm.
UCBC, but things look a little bit better. So
Okay,
I
okay.
appreciate you keeping them on the prayers.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Bev, how are you? How are you doing? And how's your son?
Well, my son's significant other died very suddenly,
Yeah, yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't share that.
and we don't know what the cause of her death. She was 45.
Yeah.
Her service will be Saturday.
Mhm,
She lives in Kansas.
mhm,
Well, the service is going to be in Kansas.
mhm.
We're at her parents'.
Yeah,
It's been just a horrendous time for Todd.
yeah.
It was so sudden and so needless that they would have married this summer,
Mhm.
and they've been going together for 6 years, waiting for all the kids to be out of the house
Right.
and not to have a really
Mhm.
bad change for the kids to
Yeah.
deal with. But it's just been awful,
Yeah,
and
yes, yeah.
I appreciate your prayers.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. All right. Okay, well, let's close with prayer then. Let's pray. Oh God, we give you thanks for this day, this chance to be together after 2 weeks, and the opportunity to share with one another and to have some just some good substantive time with one another and in these scriptures of Mark chapter 12. We do thank you for the opportunity to engage with these scriptures at a deep level and to seek to hear your voice speaking to us across the years, yet showing us um, how times, though they be very different today than biblical times in some respects, in other ways, very little has changed. And so we are grateful for you speaking to us through these words and instructing us and guiding us into your truth and into a closer alignment to your will. Lord, we do pray for all those who we hold in our hearts today. We are thankful and grateful for Sarah's opportunity to lecture at Georgia College, and pray for the success of that event on Thursday. We continue to pray for healing and for peace with Bill and with Carol. We give you thanks for some good reports. We pray for your continued healing and presence with Bev and her son Todd and their whole family as they grieve this terrible, inexplicable loss. We pray for her family as well, and pray that all involved be surrounded with your love and care and a deep awareness of your grace. Lord, we now pray all of these things in the strong name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.